Welcome everyone. My name is James Green. I'm the director of the Brazil Initiative at Brown University and a professor of history and Latin American studies and Portuguese and Brazilian studies. And for those who are coming for the first time, the Brazil Initiative is an effort at Brown University to bring together scholars, students, researchers from different disciplines who work on or think about Brazil or are interested in Brazil to learn about historical and contemporary issues related to this complex and rich country and its culture. And I'm very, very honored to introduce a wonderful emergent young scholar, Marc Hertzman, who is an associate professor in Latin American history at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His first book, Making Samba, A New History of Race and Music in Brazil, is a very important revisionist understanding of the history of samba in Brazil, meticulously researched and beautifully executed. It was published by Duke University Press in 2013, and it won honorable mention for the Bryce Wood Prize, book prize of the Latin American Studies Association, given annually to the best manuscript about Latin America and the humanities and social sciences. He has published in Hispanic American Historical Review, the Luso Brazilian Review, Conto Corriente, the Journal of Latin American Studies, and several edited volumes in Brazil. His work has also appeared in the New York Magazine, Reboot Illinois, Natchez, and he's many times asked to speak on Brazil for Al Jazeera News Service. So Marc has several new research projects. One of them he's going to talk about today, the death of Zumbi, suicide, slavery, and martyrdom in Black in the Atlantic, in Brazil and the Black Atlantic. So I won't explain the arguments around that today. But in addition to that, he has a book under contract about Gilberto Gil's album Refazenda that will be published by Bloomsbury 33 in a third series. And he has a longer term project about the Brazilian scholar Edson Carneiro and his father Antônio Joaquim de Souza Carneiro, both of whom helped shape the intertwined histories of race, radical politics, and intellectual inquiry in the century that followed abolition in 1888. Marc received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I had the pleasure when I visited once to meet him in his first year as he was starting to shape his career. I invited him to join me in Brazil that summer as I did my rounds of different archives and met people, and he dutifully followed me and got the contacts for people, and I was really amazed at how he had followed up on each and every one of those scholars, their archives, their work, and really is a very serious and dedicated scholar, and it's been wonderful to have this intellectual friendship with him over the years. Before coming to Illinois, he was the Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow in Latin American Studies at the Wesleyan University, and then assistant professor of Latin American Cultural Studies and the director of the Center for Brazilian Studies at Columbia University. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Marc here today at Brown University.
Thank you. So, Ramon, did you? Was I?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I
screwed it up.
Usually it's not in this order, but
No, I do it wrong. I apologize. Well, just hold that introduction to your minds.
remember
Did
the
it wrong.
introduction, keep it in your
Right,
hand.
exactly. So Ramon is going to speak a few minutes about the next programming of the Brazil Initiative and what's happening next semester, and then Marc will be on stage. I'm sorry. And Ramon always deserves a round of applause because without him, nothing.
First,
My bad introduction.
no problem. First, I just wanted to bring people's attention to an event that's Wednesday, November 30th, so the week after Thanksgiving. It's our last lecture of the semester. It's on, I believe, if I'm not mistaken by the title, it's Race, Migration, and the Transnational Racial Optic, and it's an alum of Brown University who is at Stony Brook University, talking about how ideas of race have shifted through migration between Governador Valadares in Brazil and here in the United States. So that'll be a really interesting talk. And then as far as the semester that is coming up, I wasn't aware that I was going to be talking about it, so I don't have the list of speakers or anything, but I wasn't planning to go through it. Basically, it's going to be, as always, we have a wide-ranging series of events, so on many different topics related to Brazil. So there'll be stuff about current politics, such as the right-wing backlash. There'll be stuff about 19th century history, and there will also be a lot of topics related to race. We're continuing our partnership and our collaboration with Africana Studies over the next semester as well. So there'll be significant. Elizabeth Horge Freeman will be here. Gladys Mitchell Walthor will be here. And we also are bringing a visual artist who's Afro-Brazilian to come to talk about his work here. So those are a few highlights, but there are others as well that I'm not remembering at the moment.
Film series.
Oh, that's right. The spring film series, which will deal with rural Brazil, that will be a combination of classic films like Cabra Marcado para Morrer, Deus e o Diabo na Terra do Sol, and then also some other more recent films that are about rural Brazil, since we often always talk about Brazil in an urban sense because so many people live in the cities. Often the rural parts of Brazil get left out, so the film series will be an opportunity to kind of look into that subject. So that's basically what's happening next semester. And you can always go on our website as well to check out the events that as we post them. Most of them are up at this point.
And without any further ado.
And without any further ado.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. A special thanks to Ramon, who we were just realizing the last time we saw each other was in Brazil, I think like almost 15 years ago, or at least 12 or 13, yeah, 12 years ago. And special thanks, of course, to Jim, who, as he said, I mean, my career would not be possible without Jim. He's helped me in so many ways for so many years. Grateful for everything, and so happy to be here. It's such an honor to be part of this amazing center and lineup of events. As Jim said, I'm doing a couple of different projects, and I think he was kind of surprised because the last time we had talked, the Carneiro project was front and center, and I'll talk just very briefly about how I got from one to the other. But the book manuscript I'm working on right now this is the title of the actual book manuscript, but it's really sort of at its initial stages. And so, I explore, I'm assuming most of you, maybe not all of you, know who Zumbi is. So he was the last leader of Brazil's great 17th century quilombo, Palmares. And the way that he died has been speculation of debate and contention for centuries. And one of the more famous accounts is depicted here. So this is from about 2007 or 2010, I forgot. There was a graphic novel depiction of Jorge Amado's Jubiabá, this great proletarian novel from the 1930s. And Zumbi appears in the novel, and but this is a pictorial depiction. And so, so the blacks not wanting to be slaves anymore, when they saw that all was lost, Zumbi threw himself from the hill, and all the others followed him. And so this is this, very long-standing account of how Palmares ended and how Zumbi died was suicide. They saw all that was lost, they saw all was lost, and they decided to kill themselves rather than return to slavery. Now, it's been disproven for many years that this was actually how the story ended. But this version, as we can see from a recent depiction, it's not something that's died altogether. And it's always interested me why people invest meaning and commitment in the actual suicide story, and then why for others it's important to disprove it. And so this is where, just to talk briefly, where the two projects sort of come together, or where one came from the other. So I was doing this project on Carneiro, who's pictured here, and his book, O Quilombo dos Palmares, which came out in the 1940s, right after Vargas stepped down from power for the first time. And in this book, this is remains a classic on Palmares, he really insists, Carneiro is Zumbi did not commit suicide, and it is very important to know that. And there are a lot of interesting meanings, I think, that have to do with self-governance, things going through the Communist Party, with race at that time. But there are many, but it's really an important point to him. And I really became fixated on it. Why is it so important? And I didn't know the whole history of, that there was this debate, but I could tell from Carneiro's book, this was, just at the very beginning, okay, it's very important to him to show that Zumbi did not commit suicide. And so that is really the seed of what now has become this book that is, trying to trace meanings attached to Zumbi's death over 3 centuries. And what I'm going to talk about today is especially in progress, I'll say, and so I'm really looking forward to having comments and critiques and questions. This is probably going to be the 3rd chapter, and it's concerned primarily with linguistic, discursive, and metaphorical death, and the lines, as we'll see, between the human and the supernatural, and between the living and the dead. And I want to start off, I think, just to orient people, even for folks who are very well versed in Brazilian history and who are even Brazilian. I think there's a few words, because we're going to be going back and forth a little bit between Africa and Brazil. There's a few words that I want to just put out there and give basic definitions of. Okay, so the first one is Zumbi dos Palmares. And so this is Zumbi with a capital Z. This is the person who we've been talking about, the last leader of Palmares. The second word is Zumbi, and you'll see here with lowercase z. And so in Central and West Africa, and as we'll see also in Brazil, Zumbi with lowercase z has many different meanings, but the basic one is soul of the deceased, a spirit, sometimes used as like an affliction. This is something that this one you don't have to worry about too much, but it'll come up a little bit. Ganga Zumbi or Gangas, these are religious mediums or authorities, and they, would be able to, in Brazil and in Angola principally, would be able to just, sort of put a Zumbi on someone, or more often heal someone who was afflicted by a Zumbi. And then finally, Zambi, and Gana Zambi, and this is supreme being, godlike figure, and you don't need to memorize these. I think the thing we're going to focus on is the difference between capital Z and lowercase z, Zumbi, and also Zambi. One of the main sort of etymological roots of this is a lot of people in Brazil will say that Zumbi his real name was Zambi, and that this was depending on how you ask, this was an error that, slaves or former slaves sort of forgot their culture, or historians since then have made a misspelling. So they've really divided these 3 things, Zambi, Zumbi with a capital Z and a lowercase z. And so what I really want to do is think about what happens when we don't understand these lines as being as fixed as people like Nina Rodrigues, Câmara Cascudo, very influential scholars have really made the division. So what happens if we sort of question, 1, why they made those divisions, and 2, what happens when we think about things more fluidly? And again, this will be really the principal kind of difference between upper and lowercase. One more point is just that the separation between these 2 things often also involves drawing an indelible line between Africa and Brazil. And so Zumbi with lowercase z, this is something that happened in Africa. When we get to Brazil, we've sort of lost track of all of this, and this is fetish is the word people are going to use a lot. This is not only a non-Christian thing, the meaning in Brazil, but it's also not even true to African roots. So Zumbi with lowercase z in Brazil is often understood to be sort of severed from both Zumbi the person and African Zumbis the souls. All right, so again, I'll hit, it may be confusing, but I'll try and hit back into this a lot, and we'll hopefully keep things straight. I want to start off, so how I got onto this specific piece, I really started thinking about things when I came across 2 very interesting cases from either side of the Atlantic, and I've been guided so far by this really wonderful quote by Maya Angelou: "A bird doesn't sing because it has an answer; it sings because it has a song." And we'll see sort of what that means in just a little bit. The basic point is that I'm not searching here for like a definitive etymological linguistic origin of the word Zumbi. Lots of people have done that, and I think it's probably an impossible task, but also I don't think it's as fruitful as what do we think about when we're not looking just for a precise answer about this one word, but a larger, symphony of meanings, if you will. So 2 references. So the first one comes from Angola, and they're both these references, I should say, are from the early 1880s. So this is a unique moment of thinking about these things, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so in 1881, the Portuguese naval officers Hermenegildo Capello and Roberto Evans, they published this account of an expedition they'd taken recently in Angola. And at one stop in the voyage, some 700 kilometers from the coast, they encountered a man who showed them a wooden object made to look like a small chapel. And on the inside, and I'm quoting here, there was a small figure representing a man with outstretched arms, and another above that looked like a small bird, said to be the Ghana Zambi. Now, Capello and Evans' text immediately became a point of reference for Brazilians who were interested in tracing African origins of local languages and customs. And this specific reference to Ghana Zambi has often been called upon as evidence that Zumbi dos Palmares, his real name, he really was Zambi, and this was sort of a corruption, a corruptela, that had been confused over time. But for all the times that this specific reference to Ghana Zambi has been cited, there's two important details that have received little, perhaps no attention. So first, there's the presence of this bird, right? And Capello and Evans actually say that their interlocutor said the Ghana Zambi is the bird, not the man. It's the bird above. But Capello and Evans, like many travelers at the time, they seem much more interested in sort of saying, oh, well, these Africans are backwards, and more interested in the idea of a human-like deity. So on the very next page, they say, well, in fact, one of us, it was Capello, they went to a farm nearby, and the people at the farm called Capello Ghana Zambi because he had this long white beard. So they're very interested in this idea of a human Zambi figure that's some sort of religious authority, maybe godlike, but not really interested in the bird. A second overlooked detail concerns the origins of the wooden object, which resembles others that they had seen elsewhere on the trip. And when they asked about it, the informant who they were talking to, all the informant could answer was simply, quote, that an ambaquista brought it from the sea. Now, ambaquistas are this group of native African slave traders that coalesced into a sort of powerful class around the slave trade. Taken on their own terms, these two details, I think, are very interesting. The bird suggests a spiritual matrix that's more complex than what Capello and Evans could or wanted to understand. And the fact that this was brought from over the sea is particularly ripe with meaning. For centuries, scholars in Brazil and across the globe have sought to trace Zumbi's origins through an African Zambi. It seems this Zambi might, at least most immediately, have traveled from Brazil to Angola and not the other way around. The overlooked details of this story are interesting, even more interesting when they're considered alongside a second example. And I'm going to come back to sort of some of the context of what's going on in the 1880s in Angola and the relationship between Brazil and West Africa. But let me give you the second example first that'll really frame things. Okay, so this one comes from Minas Gerais, from a sparsely populated area in the south. And at just about the same time that Capello and Evans are in Angola, a local pharmacist sent a surprising definition of the word Zumbi, with a lowercase, to Alfredo do Vale Cabral. He's this functionary at the National Library, and he's compiling a compendium of folklore and supernatural beings, definitions of these things. And he has this amazing definition of Zumbi that has like 9 points. It includes the human with a capital Z, but then all these other versions of lowercase c, Zumbi. One is especially interesting for this story. Okay, yes. Okay, so this is where it's taking place. I apologize. In Minas Gerais, so it's southern Minas Gerais, and this pharmacist sends this thing in to Vale Cabral in Rio, and this is the definition for Zumbi. Soul of a black preto, transformed into a bird that lingers at dusk at the edge of fazendas, pastures, or in deserted places, wailing and calling passers-by by name, and sometimes, at midday, it sings and laments the life it lived as a slave, and says, Zumbi biriri, poor thing, Zumbi biriri, poor thing. Now, if we read these two things together, I think we may be drawn towards a more expansive, perhaps more unified history of Zumbi, capital Z, than the one we are most often given. But I want to explore that now. So let's go back to Benguela in Angola, where this first example's from. So by the 1880s, this area was marked by a large presence of brasileiros, and these were people, a wide range of people who were born in Portuguese America, who had traveled back and forth across the Atlantic, and had really, and I'm really, grateful to the work of your colleague, Roquinaldo, for uncovering this, as well as Mariana Candido, that folks born in Brazil played a very important role shaping politics and culture in this area. Now, it's hard to say for sure whether this object that Capello and Ivens found was from Brazil, but I think there's good reason to think that it was. The trade, commercial trade, but the slave trade between basically ships leaving Benguela up until the 19th century, if they were going anywhere, they were going to Brazil. At one point, like almost 90% were going to Brazil. So whatever the exact origins of this bird figure, the fact that it came from overseas through the slave trade means that it very likely at least had something to do with Brazil. Now, despite the fact that Capello and Ivens were traveling through Brazil, or traveling through West Africa, just a few years, basically at the same time that folks in Brazil were writing about these things, Brazilian writers, of course, took their contemporary, Capello and Ivens' contemporary travel through Africa as a window into some distant, unchanging past, right? That like what they're seeing on the ground there is a representation of how things have always been there. And we know, of course, that how powerful that trope is in, Brazilian and other understandings of Africa, and how problematic it is. And we imagine, and especially from all the definitions attached to it, that the meaning and the meanings of Zumbi have changed over time. But the only people to really have asked that question, always reflexively interpret any deviations or differences from what they consider to be the pure, real answer as a mistake, either a mistake made by slaves and their descendants who have forgotten or mistaken their history, or scholars who have committed some kind of errors. And these scholars, Câmara Cascudo, they go into this one-upsmanship of like, oh, well, Vale Cabral, he gave a lot of good things, but he didn't know what he was talking about on this, and they correct each other. The fact that the bird in the Benguelan hinterland and the bird in Minas Gerais could have something to do with each other suggests that we may have more questions to ask about all this. At least that's what I think. And a few sort of tantalizing options or possibilities are that the version in Minas Gerais could have arrived originally from Africa. This story could have arrived from Africa, could have been developed locally, could have possibly, if we want to think really literally about the connection between Zumbi and Zumbi, maybe it came through the internal slave trade or through some sort of diaspora from Palmares after it was defeated. All of these roots are really hard to trace, and I'm not sure how much I can definitively do that, but I think it's very interesting at least to think about conceptually. What we do have, though, a good sense of certain things. So we have a good sense of the meanings of Zumbi with a little z, how it was used during the colonial era. And we have this thanks to several people who have worked with Inquisition and religious records where people have confessed or described the use of Zumbis in Angola and Brazil. In one case from Minas Gerais, also in 1756, and Minas Gerais possibly takes this very interesting role in this story, which is not a place we often associate with Zumbi. So in 1756, the slave Manuel Benguela was accused of keeping a collection of dolls and pots dedicated to Zumbi, whom, witnesses said, he adores as his god. And this is interesting for a couple reasons, because first, the wording. Most cases, most examples from this era talk about Zumbis as plural and with a little z, but this is this is suggesting a singular godlike figure rather than multiple kind of spirits. And second, again, the fact that it's in Minas Gerais at least is suggestive. Like, is there any kind of connection between this Zumbi and the ones we find, in the tradition that is, described about a century later? Hard to know for sure, but the location I think is very compelling. So we don't know how we got from point A, in the colonial period to point B with the pharmacist. We don't even know if there's a direct line, linking these two. But we do know that by the 1880s, definitions of Zumbi were sort of this hot mess of different meanings that scholars have collected and that they want to disaggregate. Okay, so scholars like Vale Cabral and then later Rodriguez and Câmara Cascudo, they see like 10 definitions of Zumbi, and what they want to do is say, well, look, these aren't really Zumbis. This doesn't have anything to do with this guy. There's this, this process of ordering and separating and defining. And this, interestingly, links up with some of the things that are going on in the rest of the Portuguese world. So Capello and Evans, when they're going to Africa in the 1880s, this is part of what one scholar in a book just published talks about as a renewed awareness of empire among Portuguese intellectuals who, in the late 19th century, start going to South Asia and to Africa and try and sort of like renovate, or reinvigorate the idea of a Portuguese empire by collecting folk tales and details on the ground, making maps, ethnographies, stuff that we're probably all familiar with from different eras and places. And so their work, these Portuguese guys, they rise up around the same time as folks elsewhere in Europe. Elie Chatelain and other missionaries are doing the same thing in Africa. And interestingly, around the same time that folks in Brazil are taking really new interest in understanding African linguistic and cultural origins. So in 1888, the year that slavery was abolished, Silvia Romero lamented the fact that Brazilian scientists had not paid more attention to African languages and religion. That same year, João Ribeiro published a short entry on the black element in his Dicionário Gramatical. And so with these two texts, this linguist Ieda Pessoa de Castro wrote, timidly began the first chapter of the history of studying the African roots of Brazil's Portuguese language. And in this linguistic, sort of focus on where does Portuguese come from and how has it been influenced by African languages, interesting things start to happen with Zumbi. And again, we got to keep both Zumbis in view here. So Zumbi dos Palmares, he is becoming, in the 19th century, more and more part of at least regional histories that folks in Alagoas and Pernambuco are starting to write about him and Palmares. It's sort of generally understood that he didn't become sort of a national figure until like around the time Edson Carneiro was writing about him, or the 1920s and 30s. But I think that some of what I'm finding actually suggests that, and if we really push this further with sort of like a popular understanding of Zumbi, I think that he's becoming national much earlier. But in any case, in the 1880s, he's becoming more part of national histories, or regional histories at least. And little z Zumbis are moving from in the written record at least, they're moving from records previously of the Inquisition and other religious investigations to these scholars, Vale do Cabral and others. And those others, just to remind us, they're really kind of ignoring any kind of back and forth between Africa and Brazil, or any kind of possible change over time in Brazil. They're seeing something that's written about Africa at the same moment and saying, oh, this is how things were before the slave trade, right? And this then is the real thing, and whatever we have in Brazil is some sort of corruptelo or mistake. Now, so the Brazilian authors who wrote about the word Zumbi, they seemed intent on kind of completing two tasks that are sort of at cross purposes. So on the one hand, they're compiling as many definitions as possible, and on the other, they're dismissing some of those definitions, and they're saying, well, actually, this guy got it wrong, or these folks, they kind of got confused about their own tradition. And so Câmara Cascudo, for example, would cite Vale Cabral and then point out his errors, and others would do the same. And in the end, they would say that the real meaning of Zambi, or popular classes, for example, had mistaken, for example, the real meaning of Zambi and erroneously replaced an A with a U to create the big Z Zumbi, which was in turn not to be confused with little z Zumbi. Vale Cabral is a case in point. So his compendium, again, includes all these definitions, 9 total definitions just about Zumbi. And some really interesting ones from Africa, from Brazil. One in particular that's interesting, he describes these popular songs that describe Zumbi wolfmen and other spirits. And so together, this collection really suggests sort of a very polysemic, multivariate, definition of Zumbi, or collection of definitions, that both resonate and depart from earlier colonial definitions. They take on new specificity. So now there's a wolfman, which was actually, interestingly, is the Wolfman becomes sort of a reference made alongside Zumbi that some people say, yeah, is real. Like Silvio Romero is one of the first people to say this. He says this is real. Câmara Cascudo totally dismisses it. He says, no, this is their mistake. The Wolfman has nothing to do with this. And a lot of times the distinctions that are being made are sort of, they seem, the significance isn't that, doesn't seem to be that important other than one-upsmanship. So one scholar wrote, the term Zumbi is an abuse, a corruptela of Zambi, and another Zumbi is a corruption of Zambi. Now, while in some cases there was nothing at stake, in others there was a very important larger point that was trying to be made. So this is from Vale Cabral, who had those 9 definitions. And he wrote, Little Z Zumbi and Zambi are often confused in the Brazilian tradition. But as we can see, they reflect different beings. Zambi referring to a superior being, something close to their master, someone who deserves respect. We can think of the Capello in Africa, right, where he's, because of his long white beard. This fact proves Zumbi dos Palmares was called this because he was the leader, the chief, the boss, the most powerful in the African Republic of Palmares. Okay, so but distinct, Zambi and capital Z Zumbi, distinct from little z Zumbi, which are often confused in the Brazilian tradition. Zumbi dos Palmares was not related to little z Zumbi, and was instead a man who had been assigned this title of respect that had been misspelled or misrepresented over time. And though he doesn't come out clearly and say it, the implications of how we think about slavery and memories of Palmares and Zumbi are really significant here, I think. Under this way of thinking, there's not really any way to link the Zumbi bird in Minas Gerais to Zumbi dos Palmares. And we don't know if we have to connect those things, but we can't with this sort of framework. So let's look a little bit further now at a few more examples and think about what's at stake with this definition and this separation. Okay, and so we're going to be firmly back in Brazil. And again, I feel like the documentation I have here is still very thin, but nonetheless alluring. There's more solid empirical ground, to be sure, for analyzing what folks like Vale Cabral and these Brazilian folklorists were after. And also to understanding the outcomes. And I'll say that there's 2 main outcomes of what these guys are trying to do. One is they are clearly, delineating between Christianity and not only African religion, but also Afro-Brazilian religion, and between the two, that like Afro-Brazilian religion is a corruption of the original African version, or what's understood to be. And then the second outcome is the separation from Africa and Brazil that is religious but also not religious. So there's a religious differentiation and a geographic differentiation. And we can see sort of what's at stake religiously through another example. Okay, so in 1889, Macedo Soares publishes this etymological dictionary that's very much a part of this era that I'm talking about. And he acknowledged an abundant set of meanings that linked Zambi and God. But what God, he asked? Certainly not the Christian God, and even less the God that Africans love. The God of Os Negros, and that is blacks in Brazil, is a fetish. So each of these distinct beings, Christian God, an African God, a black Brazilian God, were in turn distinct from little z Zumbi, which Macedo Soares called the devil or bad God, soul from another world, ghost, wolfman, and, quite interestingly, the soul of the black transformed into a bird that singles or whistles or shouts in the night. Now, this is a great example of that process of Macedo Soares and others putting a bunch of different definitions, sort of one on top of another, and then saying that some of them are not correct, right? Or they're drawing lines, in this case, between 3 different kinds of deities. On the one hand, he's pointing us towards possibly a more connected, expansive history, the bird, right, that keeps appearing, and on the other hand, very clearly drawing lines around different aspects. Now, it's especially significant that Macedo Soares distinguished Brazilian and African Zumbis, and this differentiation reached sort of an apogee of sorts decades later in 1964. Câmara de Cascudo goes to Africa and he writes this book, Made in Africa. And he publishes, develops a piece that he'd been working on for a long time, published in other forms, about Zumbi. And in that version, this is what he wrote. So he basically goes to Angola and he can't find anyone talking about Zumbis. And this is what he says about that. In Angola, nobody spoke his name to me in any colloquial setting, even when I heard so many other fantastic stories. The immortal Zumbi, and this is interesting because he's so careful to differentiate between lowercase and capital Z Zumbi. Here he capitalizes and seems to be talking about Zumbi Palmares, but clearly is actually talking about little Z Zumbi. So, these people who are drawing these lines also get confused or don't hold themselves to the same standard. But the immortal Zumbi is condemned to death by time. But as the Kimbundu say, Mukuani Kafue, who doesn't die. Okay, so this is just sort of this long-term sort of final conclusion to Africa was severed from Brazil, and in fact, because of that, and because things are unchanging in Africa, this tradition of Zumbis there is gone. Okay, so not only is what we have in Brazil disconnected from what originally was, we don't have anything that originally was because in Africa they've let it die. So there's really a lot of judgment on folks in Africa and folks of African descent in Brazil too, of that they haven't held the flame. One final, and really as you guys are seeing, and I thank you for bearing with, there's a couple more final examples I want to talk through, and what I'm at right now is I have these really compelling examples and I'm still trying to figure out what to do with. One final example on sort of the religious tip of how Zumbi is entrenched in this idea of Christianity versus other religions, and then we'll do one more compelling bird example, I think, and then we'll call it quits. So so this one, 1885, Juiz de Fora, Minas Gerais again. An author wrote about this colonial soldier who helped defeat Palmares. And this guy was renowned for every time he would kill someone, he'd baptize them. Okay, so this was he was this religious warrior. He was, the author wrote, as adept with, quote, the harquebus and the dagger as with religion's inimical arms. Now, sadly in this case, eternal salvation was not possible for those in Palmares, and it was specifically because of the suicide, or the story of the suicide. So, as the author wrote, Zumbi sought a terrible death, throwing himself from the peak. Zumbi, like most of his compatriots, were criollos, so they were born in Brazil, of the second generation of Palmares, where they knew no other religion than the most grotesque fetishism. Okay, so again, totally, they've forgotten everything that was before. Uninstructed in Christianity, unmoored even from their African religious practices, and dying by suicide, Zumbi's body was never recovered and could not, therefore, be baptized. And this, of course, let me just reemphasize, is not true, right? I mean, his body was recovered and decapitated and displayed in public. But in this story, again, using the suicide, it was not. So this guy dies, the Christian soldier dies, and he's buried in a convent in Alagoas. And there, over the course of 2 nights, many years later, a monk starts to see these apparitions. And a, quote, combat ensued between his conscience and fear. The thing was supernatural and only visited him. So the monk is having these visions at night, and he doesn't know what to do. And so finally he talks to the other monks, and they're like, you need to talk to the spirit. So this is his conversation. Who are you, brother, and what do you want? I am Sebastião Dias Manelli, who erred and suffers for letting Zumbi die without rescuing his soul from eternal sin. So he wakes up the next morning, talks to the monks, this is what had happened, what should we do? They baptize Manelli, they do a solemn baptismal act on Manelli's grave. I mean, Manelli, of course, was baptized, but this was, quote, hoping to extinguish the sins of the chief of Palmares and rescue his spirit for heaven. What is certain, says the legend, is that the following day the community heard a prolonged sigh emitting from the grave. Patent proof that the spirit of Manelli would remain in peace and free of remorse, and since then, the convent's peace was never disturbed. Okay, so this sort of third-party baptism, way after the fact, not even really baptizing Zumbi because we don't know where his body is, but the guy who possibly killed him or was around or saw his suicide anyways. So this is a remarkable story, fantastical in every sense. And it emphasizes how important the meaning of death was, and just sort of understanding Zumbi, and also his relationship to the supernatural. And it's worth emphasizing here, of course, that if birds, wolfmen, and little z Zumbis were, profane, Christian spirits, were freely allowed to communicate from beyond the grave, right? I mean, nothing is raised to the fact that this monk is talking to a spirit. So you have this separation going on in many different ways of, who can be Christian, who can't be, what the real Zumbi is and what his place is or what their place are in Brazil. And then we have one final piece to the story that, again, will bring us back to birds, and that I'm very interested to have sort of your take, because it feels like it's really pushing the boundaries a little bit here, but nonetheless very compelling, I think. Okay, so in this one comes roundabout from Câmara Cascudo. So this, in his Dicionário do Folklore Brasileiro, he does one of these, like, I'm correcting other scholars. And he says, another scholar earlier, enganou-se, like fooled himself by confusing Zumbi and Zambi. And then Cascudo also writes that there's also a confusion between Zumbi and Saci-pererê, who in fact is a little black boy, un negrinho, confused with Saci, there's a little black boy, confused with Saci-pererê, who appears on the roads of Sergipe. And there's a couple other times that Câmara Cascudo links Saci-pererê and Zumbi and says, oh, but it's just a mistake. It's one of these things that, like, people talk about them together, but they're not the same thing. And I think that itself, to me, is interesting, that if people are talking about them together, maybe there is a relationship. And so I've been digging a little bit more now in the iconography and imagery around Saci-pererê. So this is this study in, like, the 19-teens that Monteiro Lobato did. He had a bunch of people, like, send me your Saci-pererê stories. Who is he? And really interesting stuff that comes up with it. So one of his central features is his whistle. And yeah, it's it's normally a C. Or no, it's actually normally S-A-C-I with an accent is how it's normally spelled now. And his origins are very interesting. There's a lot of links to indigenous traditions, not only in Brazil, but in Uruguay and Argentina. He's normally depicted as this black boy or figure that has one leg and that haunts slaves or little children. There's all these stories that get sent in. One of the central features is his whistle, and then, significantly, he is almost always associated with birds. And so a couple of accounts that got sent in. So one reads the following. When Saki was sad, he would transform into a bird and sing in the dark corners of the chicken coops, with the sun hot outside, a nostalgic song repeated every 5 minutes, Saki. Others emphasize the trickster, slightly malevolent character, but linked the bird figure to Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, and specifically to slaves there. So whether lamenting or tormenting those in chains, this bird-like figure, again, I think, suggests another possible compelling link with all these different Zumbi figures and meanings, and there's descendants and different versions that we've seen not only in Africa, but then also in Brazil. All right, so what do we do with all of this? I'm still trying to figure out myself, and I'll be very interested to hear what you guys think. But let me just give a couple of thoughts and a couple sort of set of questions that I'm trying to think through. So on the one hand, these stories add up to a history of division and distinction on the part of European and Euro-Americans, right? Who, even while collecting more and more diverse meanings of this of Zumbi, repeatedly attempt to segregate and define one from the other. That Zumbi is not the same as Zambi, and is definitely not the same as Zumbi with a little z. And on the other hand, in these collections, we see suggestive evidence of what I think could be interpreted possibly, but it really depends on how far we can go with this, as something more expansive and unified. And again, the fact that someone like Câmara Cascudo is saying that, people who I talk to are confusing one figure with the other, that itself is very interesting, because I think, we don't have to take Câmara Cascudo at his word that these people are confused. I think more interesting is that people are talking about this in the first place. But again, sort of the documentary, how to build from that is very challenging, I think. And the most compelling to me is the fact that we have slaves during the colonial era in this same region, talking about Zumbis and different, deploying Zumbis, being brought before the Inquisition because of that. And then we have this really interesting reference from the 1880s about a slave who, had died and taken on the form of a bird, and this is called Zumbi. It's hard for me not to think of some sort of connection to Zumbi and Palmares, but again, how far can we go? So I've sort of boiled it down to, I think, two sets of questions. And the first one is along the lines of how far do we compass these, how far can we try to connect these compelling, if scattered references that seem to link Saci-pererê and bird like Zumbi across time and space. Is it enough, I have that quote by Maya Angelou that I really like, this idea of, sort of thinking of a song but not an answer, but ultimately where does that lead us? And now that I've been reading much more into the, Hokinaldos and Maria Cândido and the literature on West Africa, how much of this is an African story that needs to be pursued, and I'm not sure if that's within my means, and how much of this is a Brazilian story and, brings us down to Minas Gerais to understand Zumbi. There's lots of sort of questions there of where to go with it. And then second, and this one is much more attainable but somewhat less interesting, I think, is asking, and I think I have a pretty good sense though already, but why did Vale Cabral, why did Câmara Cascudo, why did these white, folklorists, why was it so important to them to make these different differentiations? And again, I think most of the answers are fairly, not surprising, that this is part of this larger process of differentiating Brazil from Africa, even while incorporating some sort of African tradition, about distinguishing Christianity from other religions. I guess the most interesting thing here to me probably is the 1880s, that how much of this is happening in the last decade of slavery and of the monarchy just clearly has something to do with how Brazil is, and what I've cut out of here, a lot of the discussions with Vale Cabral and his interlocutors have to do with like formation of a state and all of this. So I think there's definitely an interesting story there. Again, the most exciting to me is, can we think of, this is some sort of expansive, slave tradition and memory of slavery, but again, with doubts about how far to take that. So, so I'm very interested to hear critiques, questions, everything, and I'll stop there. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Jim.
So, if I remember from what you said from your first quote from Bengala, they found a figure which was a capella, and there was a man in it with his arms outstretched and a bird. So
Exactly.
immediately I think of the Espírito Santo, the Jesus figure, and the Holy Ghost through the Espírito Santo, which is tremendously enriched in Christian iconographic figures.
Right.
And the Spirit is God, the connection between God and Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's another area that you have to really kind of explore this deeply, because it's very suggestive that that's a powerful connection from that one anecdote at least, and perhaps other sources will link that.
Yeah, thank you so much, because actually, one of the examples I have, one of the observers talks specifically about some sort of, what they would understand as like a syncretic, like, companion to the Spirit and the Holy Ghost. So, I do need to think about that a lot more.
And if I may, just as another part of that, is that it's a moment, I don't know if it's a moment in Brazil, but it's certainly a moment in Europe, and maybe in Portugal, but certainly in France, of a signifying of Mary, and the cult of Mary becomes consolidated in the 1880s. This is when Fatima becomes important as well. So it could also be connected to things around Jesus and the cult of Mary, and a refiguring of the Catholic Church and different symbols in the Catholic Church in Europe. Might be an influence. Even maybe in the way they're reading this.
Right.
What if this is a black figure? This is a white figure? Is it a Jesus? Is it carved wood? Therefore, it's of the color of wood. And what does that mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you, Jim. That's great. And and this is the thing, is like, that's the most compelling reason to like try and. I mean, I would never be able to find the actual object, but like it would be really nice to know what the object looked like a little bit more. But great, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
This is just such a fascinating project. Thank you for presenting what you found. I kept on thinking about I think it was last year or the year before, there was an article that came out talking about the figure of Zumbi in Haiti and in voodoo culture, and looking at the connections between Zumbi and zombie, and how our ideas around zombie apocalypse comes from this construction of Zumbi in voodoo culture, which I'm assuming comes from the same cultures that were transported to Brazil and changed while in Brazil. And so I think that it'd be really interesting to see the ways in which this idea of Zumbi spreads across the Black Atlantic, because I'm also then thinking about in Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, Sugar Man Done Gone Fly Home, and thinking about the ways in which Black slaves in the U.S. that the idea that they fly home, that their souls kind of turn into birds, that is a very common imagery within Black American context. So it'd be really interesting to see how this spreads across the Black Atlantic, this Zumbi idea.
Thank you so much. Yeah, because both of those are things I've been thinking about a lot, and they're really fantastic ideas. So, yeah, so the zombie, origins seem very compelling. Again, etymologically, and I think it's just, this is more from Vodun, and I don't know that article, so I'd love to know the specific one that links Zumbi. Interestingly, this is something that Câmara Cascudo, and Câmara Cascudo at least talks about this and says, oh, it's really interesting how they have zombies in Haiti and they have nothing to do with our zombies. And so again, it's very clear, what kind of diaspora do we have? But again, but absolutely, but clearly there's got to be some kind of links here. So the Song of Solomon and Flying Home is really, this article that's coming out about slavery and suicide in the Americas. And one of the things that's really struck me, and it is one of the reasons specifically why the birds are so interesting, is that, and Brazilians or Brazilianists here who know of an exception to this, I've been asking, I don't know of any. So in the U.S., this is a very strong tradition, especially in South Carolina, and it goes into the Caribbean. People have written about this basically from South Carolina to Jamaica and Cuba. Esteban Montejo talks about it, the idea of flying home, that it's not suicide, it's flying home. And and there's some really good work on slave suicide in Brazil now, but I've never heard of a flying home metaphor in Brazil. And that's the original reason that I got onto this bird. The bird is is that this? Because it seems like, so yeah, I'm really interested in that, and that's kind of one of my initial thoughts is this a version of that? So thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Awesome. Very glad to meet you. And to hear one more such interesting research from you.
Thank you.
And your talk made me remind, I don't know why, but it made me remind of the figures we have in Brazil to frighten people, which are the carrancas, you know that? The carrancas, they are wooden heads. They were actually Portuguese, and they were put on the
Flatbed
ships,
boats.
the
Flatbed boats.
Yeah,
on the
the
Rio São
boats,
Francisco.
to frighten bad spirits to the travel to cross the ocean, and then they were took by the black religious people to put them on the door of the religious houses to frighten mainly white people. So this made me think about Zumbi and Zombie question. Zombie, yeah, because Zombie will be the supreme leader of these people.
Right.
So the great leader, and then Zumbi, we don't like to call him Zumbi very much because Zumbi is Zumbi is a bad spirit, but at the same time, Zumbi is the one who frightens people. So maybe they want to have a leader that is a huge frightener of white people.
Yeah, they know, and that I think is a really thank you so much, and I need to look more into the Kahunkas, but I think that's a really compelling idea and link, and the one person who's talked about this, in a way, is this a guy, Robert Anderson, who he doesn't show any proof, but he says that he thinks that white people during the era of Palmares, that they thought of Zumbi, the person, as also this spirit who would come haunt them and raid their plantations and stuff. And so I think that actually might be one of the most productive ways to think about this, that the way Zumbi gets talked about in Câmara Cascudo, et cetera, is actually it's this black creation, that it's bothering black people, but maybe more interesting is that actually it's a black creation, but that was giving a hard time to that was haunting white people. And there certainly is the Inquisition records and stuff. I mean, the way that people have shown pretty clearly that spirits and religious authorities who were deploying them, slave owners were asking their slaves to do these things. This is a very interracial kind of process. But I think that idea of Zumbi being this spirit to keep away white people makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
can I add a little?
Please, yeah.
This Zumbi is also, it's not only the leader that frightens, but it's also the leader that can't be murdered because he's still murdered. So this is one thing I think it's so important to think about his death, because he can't be caught because
Right.
he's
Because
already dead.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is so helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. And so I was particularly interested in the second set of questions that you had offered. And it seems to me that in the sources that you're working with in the 19th century, there are two kind of large groupings, one of which is coming from ecclesiastical sources, the church and the Inquisition. And then this kind of later generation of folklorists who are interested in nation and state building. And I wanted to ask you, how do the stakes change as you move from one group to another and interpreting Zumbi with a capital or lower in different kinds of ways? It would seem to me that the interest of these two groups is actually quite different. And in particular, I wonder if looking at what role, how these different sources deal with the issue of suicide might be a useful avenue to kind of get at this question. Because I imagine it would have a greater resonance with people in the church, or a different kind of resonance with people who are involved in the church than it would these kind of nation builders later on.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. So I think absolutely, I need to think about this more and what the stakes are. I think you're absolutely right that they're different. And the suicide is interesting because, I guess one counter argument to what you just said is that it's one of these later accounts that's obsessed with baptizing, and that and the fact that he committed suicide, this was a problem and all of this, and it prevented him from being saved. And so that there certainly is some carryover. But my sense is in terms of the stakes that and I know very little, I just, this is not, something that I spent a lot of time with the Inquisitioners and the religious, it seems to be what at stake there is, my understanding would be, what's at stake is Christianity and salvation and civilization and, and the colonial project. But pending a lot more work to be done, and thinking that I need to do and reading. But for the latter day kind of folklorists, in some ways the stakes feel a little bit lower, and that's part of the point, because I think they're what they think they're doing is really, even while they're making all these differentiations, they think it's really important for building the state and the nation. What they feel like they're collecting is this, these superstitious fetishes and these things that they're sort of going out of their way to showing is, this is kind of a curiosity. They're they're using it to build their own kind of intellectual capital. But I don't think that they don't see the distinction between Zumbi and Zumbi as something that truly is gonna, destroy the nation. What they think is their project is just making sure they get these things right, and then whatever these crazy definitions are, it matters because I have to prove myself as sort of the expert. But I got to think about it more because, as I'm saying that, that might undermine my argument a little bit. I mean, they clearly are interested in the state and what this means for building in Brazil. But my sense is the stakes are lower than they were for the inquisitors, because it seems like it's hard to think of higher stakes than, this is like whether your soul is going to be, damned forever or not, and that's like a pretty high stake. Yeah, but thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm just curious because we're talking so much about the stakes, and there seems to be a lot of implied, I assume you're going to do this, but I'd like you to speak more explicitly about the stakes of not the scholars and not the white men constructing this, but like members of the Black movement in Brazil, but also if you're making any efforts to kind of excavate into what like enslaved people in Brazil were saying about Zumbi, or how those, I know obviously that's hard to find that stuff, but kind of tracing that non-official, non-academic validated story, and what suicide, the story of suicide, why that's so important, the story of suicide, and
Right. Yeah, so, okay, thank you very much. There's, I guess, a couple levels of this. So, this is the side of it that I agree, I think is, like, to me, is more meaningful and is more important, and also extremely challenging, at least when we're talking about slavery, because trying to figure out, what people who, if they didn't leave documentary records, what they actually thought is really, really challenging. So I'm really trying to think through how to do that, and I do think that, this is at least a portion of, a partial path of like that through records from the time, and then also these, stories that get, handed down, that there may be a way to, read against the grain, as we used to say, the later, the collections by Monteiro Lobato and stuff. So I do think that I can get, something of that there, but I really am trying to think this through seriously about how much digging I can and should do through, colonial records and what will be there or what won't be. And I'm optimistic because especially like some of the things that I found, so like those Zumbi cases, the only way I found them was because Roquinaldo footnotes them, James Sweet has footnoted a couple of them, and then there's this other guy who's worked in Minas Gerais and has footnoted them. So I think there are, but they haven't been really interested in Zumbi itself. They're talking more about these larger religious matrices, So I am at least going to look through the records they've worked with, and then the question will be how much do I dig for a word. Now, in terms of like today, Black movement today and over the 20th century, there I think like much more possible, because, and this is really one of the, origins of the story, is like, why did Edson Carneiro, this really amazing, radical scholar and activist, why did it matter so much to him to prove that it wasn't suicide? And that, like, that I think I have pretty good access to and can really think through. And I haven't done interviews yet, but I think I'm very interested, and the more this project develops, the more I think it's really, some of the most interesting stories about Zumbi are not from the Northeast, but are from like Minas Gerais or, Sao Paulo, places where, so I really do, and, Rio Grande do Sul is actually where the 20 de Novembro actually originated, so there, I have a lot of hope that I'll be able to think through this, and what I've seen so far is that people have very, Black activists have different reasons for embracing rejecting or embracing the suicide story. That the suicide story, if it once was sort of this way of creating nationally, I think, wrapping Zumbi into sort of a story of racial democracy, there now is much more of this idea, I think, of like sacrifice and other things. So that I'm hopeful of, and again, thinking about how to bring it all together. I'm not sure, but yeah.
it just made me think too. Just another question. I was curious how you know that he was actually killed in his head, and then it also just makes me think of Bezuru,
Yeah.
another like mythic figure that really existed. That it's unclear if his body was ever found, and if he was really killed, and if it was a beetle, not a bird.
Right.
But he also transformed into a beetle.
That's great. Yeah, I gotta look back. I've been meaning to look back at Besouro, and I haven't. And I did not, and I haven't thought about him seriously since. So thank you for saying that. And that's really compelling.
It could even be suicide in his case too, a little bit. I've never really heard it expressed that way, but the way that he opened himself up, he was vulnerable, and he cheated on his wife, and then she betrayed him, or something. It was like, it was not really suicide, but it was like
But
a
it could be
mistake that he made, I don't know.
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I will definitely have to go back through that. So how do we know? I mean, yeah, this is the thing. I mean, when I think about it, we don't really know. What we know for sure, well, what we know is we have colonial documents that, were not used mainly until around the turn of the 20th century. But we do have colonial communications that say Zumbi is dead, and we have severed his head and taken it, to Recife and put it, posted it on a stake in public. And so Nino Rodriguez actually, he says, this both could be true. Like he says, well, actually, he could have committed suicide, and then they could have cut his head off. And I mean, it is technically true. I think that's, but the report, I mean, the rest of the report also says that there is this story now that at least there's documentary, recordings of, that there was a betrayal, and somebody, there was somebody in his inner circle who turned him in, and then there was this confrontation and that he was killed. And so we do have a colonial record that says and suggests he was killed, but I do think that that's, the way I've been moving with this story was sort of from Edson Carneiro, which is like, okay, like he didn't commit suicide, and what, but I think, it would be interesting to sort of, and scholars, like Flavio Gomez, everybody says like, okay, he didn't commit suicide, and we have proof of that. But I think it's actually right that, like, the reality is, do we 100% know for sure that he did not? I guess one final thing though, the other, there's a couple months before Zumbi died, there was this moment where a bunch of Palmarinos fell off a cliff, and basically the interpretation is that, like, they had this amazing maze of of roads, and and that their enemies might be invading, and they might fall off a cliff. And sorry, God, I'm so unaware of the microphone. Yikes! That they so that they kind of got chased there or accidentally fell off. But this is one of the things. I mean, this article that's coming out that, like, suicide is such a difficult, I mean, like, contemporaneously, it's impossible sometimes, most times, to know, like, what's the motivation for a suicide, was it suicide or not. And you have slaves jumping off boats where the slave traders say that it's suicide, but, like, how do we really know that they weren't thinking? They also think, oh, maybe they were going for water. I mean, I think it's impossible to say for sure that these people didn't think, I'm getting off this boat, and I may die doing it, but I'm getting off, and that's a little different than the idea, the idea behind these, like, Zumbi suicide is, like, I am intentionally, I am killing myself because I don't want to return to slavery, and you can imagine a much more kind of, like, complex and open-ended, like, I'm gonna jump and we'll see what happens, so it's a really, really complex. Please, no. Oh, yeah. In the back, yeah. Oh,
You've been patient, so I don't know if you want to cut it now. I can come and talk to you.
Go ask the question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, please.
I actually just want to join the trail of commentary and questions from that side. Because when I first saw the title of the project and then your beginning, I thought, okay, this is more a philological project, like the origin of the word and the different meanings that they have.
Yeah.
But as you spoke, I began to think of it not so much as a philological conundrum, as pointing to the need for understanding the social imagination and the development of African-derived religions in the Americas. I think that's really where you might be getting ready to make a very interesting and important contribution. So I wanted to say that there are other words, not just Zambi and Zumbi and Nganga, all of those which come out of West Central Africa. There are other words which became polysemic, and they're almost like a path of, if you trace those words and the changes, it's like a path of social imaginings and religious ideas of the enslaved. So for example, and I lived in Angola for a long time, so a lot of this Kikongo, Kimbundu is familiar to me from the other side. So Kalunga is one. Kalunga originally is like the Sea of the Dead, but all up and down South America, not just in Brazil, you find Kalunga has come to mean a spirit. Kalunga has come to mean an animal. Kalunga is the name of several plants. Those plants have magical or medicinal uses. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that these words that traveled are part of an evolution of a social imagination of the enslaved and the creation and then evolution of African-derived religions. The honorific titles are the same, like what is Nganga? It's an honorific title as well as a profession. Or in Brazil you see Kota Makota. Makota is given like a singular title in Brazil, but it's actually the plural of something that is Kota. Kota, the big man, the big woman. All of these things, these are words that go along with these new social imaginings, these resistances, these religions that are created off of an African, either African-derived, but they're not African. You'll not find them in Angola. You'll only find them in Brazil, but they're African-derived. So it seems to me that the path that you're on is a path that, would look at the evolution of the social imagination and the religious ideas, and on both sides of the Atlantic. Because up and down the coast of Angola, in those major cities, Luanda, Benguela, they say also that they are Creole societies.
Right.
They don't mean what people mean
Right.
by Creole in the West. It's almost like the flip side. But the same religions have evolved and emerged and go in tandem with ideas of social resistance and all kinds of things. So I just want to suggest to you that instead of a philological project
Yeah.
or how different European travelers or folklorists or whatever
Right.
saw it, I mean,
Right.
that's an interesting line of research.
Right.
But another fascinating line of research that I think your work opens up is this question of what happened to these ideas that are represented in concepts and in words and terms, and how they travel, how they get reworked, and why.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much, and this is really, it's enlightening and it's also really reaffirming, because that is exactly what I want to do with it. It also brings me back to like the stakes. I think this is a great way. The stakes for these folklorists at root was like philological. This was like, what is the exact root? And that's not what there were other things, but like that's not where the key is for me. And the way you phrased it, like social imagination, is really helpful. The other thing, I just am curious, so Kalunga, do you know, so interestingly, and this has different possible implications. So Kalunga is actually the word that this person who Capello and Evans were engaged with, that's where he says it comes from, and they translate Kalunga as the sea. So like, where did this Nganga Zumbi come from? They say Ambakistas from the Kalunga, and so they translate Kalunga literally as sea, but it sounds like that actually could be different.
It is the sea,
But it could mean something.
one meaning. It's the
Right.
sea of the dead.
Okay.
So you could
Yeah.
imagine people who are coming from West
Yeah.
Central Africa to the
Right.
Americas in slavery, they really feel like they've
The
traversed
sea of the dead.
the sea of the dead.
Yeah.
We
So
call
it's
it the
even
Middle
more-
Passage, which
Right.
is kind of sanitized, but
Right.
it was
Yeah.
really the sea of the dead. And in Congo cosmology,
Mm.
there is this sea, Kalunga, which separates the world of the living from the world of the dead.
All right. Yeah. So
But it takes on hundreds, you can find it not just in Brazil, but Mexico, anywhere where there were enslaved Africans who came from that region. And Kalunga took on a life of its own, like Zumbi
Right.
took on a life of
Right.
its own, drop the N, and then you have all
Right.
kinds of stuff. Or Nkisi. Nkisi is another one. Nkisi in Congo is a consecrated medicine, or the packet or the container it's in. But in Brazil, people talk about Nkisi like they talk about loas in voodoo or orishas. In some branches, shall we say, of candomblé, Nkisi is an orisha. But that's not the meaning, the old meaning of Nkisi. So these things evolve,
Right.
and they evolve with, like I said, social imagination and religious ideas and resistance and
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
So I want to thank Marc again for a wonderful lecture. It really makes us all happy to be here at Brown University. I think to have these wonderful people coming and visiting us.